Happy New Year. Hello and welcome to the first Frost Over the World of 2012. In a packed programme this week, we'll be looking at some of the stories which we expect to dominate the world's headlines for much of the next year. The head of the London Olympics, for example, Sebastian Coe, will be bringing us the latest stop-press news on the Olympics. And we'll be talking about the global economy, about Libya, about the US election and a surprise result this week. But we begin in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. This week has seen yet another assassination, the fourth of its kind, of an Iranian nuclear scientist in Tehran. The United States denies any involvement, but the blame game is in full swing. The news comes at a delicate time as the toughest sanctions yet are imposed on the Iranian regime, and tensions rise over Iran's threats to close off the Straits of Hormuz. Not too far away, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has entered the new year with a not-so-new stalemate on negotiations between the two sides. Joining me to discuss the US role in the region is a man who's in many ways helped shape the negotiations process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and up until recently, chief White House advisor, for example, on Middle East policy. It's Ambassador Dennis Ross by name, and here he is in action. Dennis, thank you very much indeed for joining us. If we could start with something quite topical in terms of another assassination of an Iranian nuclear scientist, the fourth of its kind. Who would you say are behind those covert operations?
Well, the short answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm aware of all the speculation, but the short answer is I don't know. I do know this. I know that the United States has not been involved and has not viewed this as the right means for trying to affect Iranian behavior.
In general, of course, you've been very much an advocate of a hardline policy of hard sanctions with Iran, haven't you? You've been in favour of that all along.
I have been in favor of pressure on the Iranians because I believe that they were not going to be induced into changing their nuclear program. I've been a believer that they had the right to have civil nuclear power, but they don't have the right to have nuclear weapons. I've been a believer that they have rights under their obligations and being a signatory of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I also believe they have responsibilities they have to live up to.
People often ask the situation of Iran having a nuclear weapon. Why is it logically that it's okay for Israel, another power in the Middle East region, being permitted to have a nuclear weapon, but Iran not? What is the logical justification of that?
First, the Israelis don't admit to being a nuclear weapons state, but Iran is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and according to that treaty, they have the right to have civil nuclear power, but they have to reveal all their nuclear-related activities, and that's something they have consistently not done. We look at Iran not only in terms of not living up to its obligations under that treaty, but we also look at Iran as a country that has engaged consistently in supporting terror. We looked at it as a country that threatens its neighbors. And we see that if Iran were to acquire across that threshold, all of its neighbors would likely feel threatened and feel that they should have that capability as well. Then you're in a situation where you turn the Middle East into a nuclear weapons zone. Here's a region that is characterized by conflict. It has all sorts of local triggers for conflict. It is an area where the communication between different regimes is not great. The potential for miscalculation would be very high. And so you look at a transformed region in terms of the danger of nuclear weapon or countries acting on a hair trigger. It's something that threatens, I think, the region and the world. And if Iran wants to have civil nuclear power, that is its right and it ought to have it. But if it wants to have nuclear weapons, it's something that threatens everybody. And I believe from an American standpoint is a danger. And it's something to be prevented.
But I see why you're making that point. But I mean, in fact, we do all know that Israel has got nuclear weapons and has tested them and used them. So in fact, a lot of what you were just saying is irrelevant because we know that they have nuclear weapons in a way that Iran does not.
Well, we don't know that Israel, you said that they've tested them and used them. We don't know that, number one. They certainly haven't used them. But number two, let's take the presumption of your question and let's just recognize an interesting reality. Most of Israel's neighbors for a long time have made the same assumption you have, and yet none of them felt obliged to have nuclear weapons. None of them apparently felt threatened by what they assumed to be the case. And yet all of them, when they look at the Iranians, and they look at the Iranians having nuclear weapons, they take a very different posture. The Saudis and others have stated if the Iranians have it, they have to have it. And so you're talking about a very different dynamic. So I think, again, there's a reason we have great concerns about the Iranians having nuclear weapons, but it's pretty clear that most of Iran's neighbors seem to share that concern.
Do you share that concern 100% that Iran is dangerous in a way that Israel is not?
I do. I am concerned that Iran with nuclear weapons it just changes the realities in a way, as I said, that increases the prospects of there actually being a nuclear war in the Middle East. There is not an equation that is equivalent to what we saw during the Cold War. First of all, it wouldn't only be bilateral. Secondly, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had channels for communications. And even then, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came much closer to nuclear war than anybody realized at the time. To create a situation in the Middle East where, as I said before, you don't have great channels of communication, you have all sorts of local triggers for conflict, you would not have what you had during the Cold War, which were each country having what might be described as secure second strike capabilities. In the Middle East, you'd have countries that couldn't afford to strike second. You're just creating a very different circumstance. And I would even say, from the Iranian standpoint, if they think they're going to be better off with having nuclear weapons, I think that's a fundamental miscalculation from their own standpoint. They're not going to be better off. It's not going to give them a kind of leverage in the region. It's going to produce other countries that have it, and it's going to increase the dangers of a nuclear war, and they aren't going to be the beneficiaries of that either.
I know, Dennis, that you are a very strong supporter of Israel and so on, but don't you feel we should have performed better in terms of limiting the level of illegal settlements rocketing from 200,000 to 600,000? The free world has just let Israel get away with it.
Well, look, I've never been a fan of settlement activity. I don't see ultimately how it serves Israel's interests. I don't see how it serves the cause of peace. But I also think that if in fact we could focus on something that President Obama offered in two speeches in May of last year, you could actually deal with the issue and resolve it. Meaning, if you focused on the issue in negotiations of borders and security, then you would resolve the issue of settlements, because the only place they would be built would be built in what would be part of Israel and not part of what would be the Palestinian state. Settlements as an issue are one of the permanent status issues that was identified back in the original Camp David Accords. So I think the way to deal with the settlement issue now is in the negotiations to resolve the question of borders. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that I think the president, when he presented this in two speeches in May, one of the reasons he did so was because if you deal with issues like security and borders, you're not dealing with what I would call the narrative issues. Jerusalem and refugees are the narrative issues for the two sides. It's a lot harder for the two sides to get at those issues, at least initially, if you create a foundation in the negotiations where each side can see that, for the Palestinians, they can see basically the outlines of their state. The Israelis can see that their security is going to be addressed. If you create that kind of a foundation, then it becomes easier to take on what I call the narrative issues for each side that go to the heart of self-definition and identity.
Dennis, thank you very much indeed for sharing those thoughts with us, which we really greatly appreciate. Thank you very much for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Revolutions, riots, regime change. last year saw the world turned on its head with uprisings and protests from Cairo to Athens, Wall Street to Westminster, Budapest to Tel Aviv. But why is it happening now? One man thinks he may have the answers. Has got the answers, he thinks, in fact. Paul Mason, economics editor of BBC Newsite, has communed with protesters at Tahrir Square, smelt the tear gas in Athens, and tweeted to millions. His latest book, out right now, attempts to explain why it's kicking off everywhere. And he's here right now. Welcome, Paul. Very good to have you with us. For some people reading the book and reading what you say, that you come over slightly as an Old Testament doom-laden prophet, you know, harky, harky, the day of judgment is at hand, and so on. Is your message that gloomy, do you think?
I don't think my message is gloomy. I've been inspired by watching young people across the world unplug the earbuds of the iPod and listen to what's going on and take part in some of the greatest events they will ever experience in their lives. The Egyptian revolution being just one of them. I think what I'm saying is that we are in a deep economic crisis, but we have a generation that's woken up in the Middle East, lost its fear, in the West, lost its apathy, and has started to do stuff. Whether that ends up with a progressive solution or the whole thing falls apart, we're just in the middle of the events. But no, I'm not doom-laden. I think we are in the middle of a massive, massive wave of protest and unrest.
And your figure, the figure that you return to it, is the figure of the graduate with no future. Why is that such an important figure?
If you look at what's been the catalyst of some of the protests, whether it's in Tahrir Square, whether it's in Syntagma Square in Greece, you always find a similar social type. And this is a young person, graduate or student, who, as I put it, they've had their future cancelled. The Lehman Brothers, the financial catastrophe that we've gone through, has changed the whole curve of their lives. They've been newly empowered by technology. They can talk to each other, even across borders. I met people in Tahrir who'd been on the student protests in London. There were people who went in the Israeli protests.
They have a bit of money anyway.
Well,
to get
cheap flight and a Twitter feed. You can sort of make links. You sleep on people's floors. They're the same kind of people, and what they have in common is that the economics of the current situation are very bad for them for the foreseeable future. And I think this is what's caused this loss of fear, loss of apathy.
That it'll come better when?
Well,
for them, if at all, or in 10 years? Or?
It's not a question of whether we get an economic upturn. I mean, even in America, we might see right now the bottom of the worst of the economic figures. The question is, they'll be paying for our old age. They'll be surviving in their old age on the stock markets that don't look very bright. They will be coping with climate change, and they are starting their careers, if they get jobs. In Spain, we've got near 50% youth unemployment. They're starting careers on historically low and stagnant wages. This is the story of capitalism, the story of self-betterment. I keep finding people who can more easily imagine themselves as celebrities on a million than they can as comfortably middle class. That's the tragedy of the modern situation. I can't see a way out of it unless we get a big change in the economic system.
And in the meantime, you say, therefore, truth moves faster than lies, and also propaganda becomes flammable. Why and how does truth move faster than lies?
Well, you have been in this business of media, of news, much longer than me, but we're both in a way veterans of a world where the hierarchy ruled. That if someone had a big name and a big picture byline and earned a huge salary, what they said went. Now, on Twitter, such people find it quite hard to get a voice. It's got to be true. And when millions of people can say, hey, you say this, but I'm just checking it out, either against my experience here on the street, where you say this is happening, but it isn't, or I've been to the sources and you're wrong, and they will throw these truths back at the purveyors of half-truth or lie. And I think the spin doctor and the propagandist has a real hard time in the era of social media.
Right. And at this moment, can you see where the canary is going to be in the mine shaft? Can you see where it's going to go
It's not so much where you get protests next. I think we've had a big wave of protest, and in places like Egypt,
parts of it have been dying out a bit.
I think that Egypt has a long way to go. Tunisia, we've seen even now. I've just come back from Budapest. big protests against the government there. I think the theme of 2012, though, is who gets what out of these revolutions. And I think we will inevitably see entering a year of economic nationalism, where people say, look, enough of idealism and enough of waiting for globalisation to sort itself out and enough of waiting for Europe. We here are starving, we've got no work, we've got no jobs, and you do see governments and parties coming to the fore who offer people a national exit route. Hungary is a good example.
But you're really saying that things may get better in a year or two, but that this year, let's face it, 2012 is going to be terrible.
We might have a couple of big catastrophes this year. Europe, we just don't know what's going to happen there. We just don't know. And the international situation is not looking too bright either on the diplomatic front. But I think if we look beyond it, the challenge for people who are, look, the front covers of the Financial Times are constantly running a strap saying crisis of capitalism. The big crisis is what's the model? What is the sustainable model that's going to deliver growth to those small towns in Greece, Italy, Spain, where there's huge unemployment? What's going to give the youth of Tahrir Square an economic future? I think that's the big unanswered question of 2012, 2013. Until we find it, that we're in a very scratchy social and protest situation.
Well, we wish you success in finding these sprouts of growth or canaries and etc. But thank you very much for being with us. Good luck with the book, and may it go superbly in a wonderful 2012, but you don't think that?
I just think we're, both of us, and our profession, we're going to be covering probably some of the biggest events of our lifetime.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next month will mark the first anniversary of the Libyan revolution, which ended more than 40 years of dictator Colonel Gaddafi's rule and culminated, of course, in his killing, in his death. The interim government, the National Transitional Council, is now struggling to bring lasting peace and stability to a country still fraught with tension, dissatisfaction and armed militias. But is the NTC capable of building a new Libya? How and to what extent should the Western NATO powers be involved in the nation-building process? With me now is journalist Portia Walker, who spent the last 8 months in Libya covering the revolution and its aftermath. Welcome, Portia. Good to have you with us.
Good to be here, David.
Do you think that, in fact, that the new Libyan government will be able to bring these targets to fruition? Democracy, getting rid of the militias, etc.?
Well, I think everyone's very hopeful, and there's a huge amount of support for the NTC internationally and within Libya as well. But I think obviously 2011 was a huge year, not just in Libya but throughout the region. We saw a number of governments, a number of leaders who had been in power for decades swept aside, and I think in Libya it was certainly one of the most complete instances of regime change. Gaddafi was killed, his people who had worked for him are now in hiding, and there's been a complete change. But in a funny way, that's perhaps been the easy bit. Sweeping things aside, people are very united, they're very excited, there's a huge feeling of euphoria. What the NTC now face is something that's much harder, and in a way, it's much less exciting and perhaps more divisive. They've got to build an entirely new country. They've got to build new institutions.
And in this situation, you've not only got the forces, the pro-Gaddafi people who remain and the anti-Gaddafi people, but you've got the tribal links and rivalries and militias. Unity is going to be tough, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think there are sort of two schools of thought on this. I mean, Libya doesn't have the sectarian cleavage that we see in Iraq or the different groups that you have in Syria or in Egypt. I mean, it's actually quite a homogenous country. There's only around 6 million people. They're all Sunni. So on the face of it, we can be quite optimistic about Libya. But as you pointed out, there are tribal divisions, and there's also, Libya was originally three different states, and there's rivalry between the East and the West, and even more recently, during the revolution, there's rivalry between different cities about who they felt contributed most to the revolution. Some people feel they suffered particularly bad losses and that their fighters made a much larger contribution than other cities elsewhere in the country.
So in fact, are the militias something that can be brought under control, or could there be civil war?
I am sceptical about the possibility of another civil war in Libya, but I think we are going to see more of the clashes we've seen over the last couple of months. The government is making a very concerted effort to organise people handing back guns, to absorb these independent militias either into the army or into a new police force or border security. But it is very hard when you have a country that is awash with weapons in the way that Libya is now.
And what attitude do you think, Portia, they should take to people who worked for Gaddafi, obviously, and were not guilty of crimes necessarily, of course, but in that situation, they have experience, those people, experience that's needed. On the other hand, there would be strong feelings that none of those people should be put back into any form of power at all. What decision will they take?
Well, I think that's absolutely one of the key issues they're facing now. And looking at Iraq and what happened with de-Baathification, I think that's a spectre that looms over Libya right now. And I think the NTC and the international community are very aware that if you blacklist everyone who worked for Gaddafi, you wipe out an entire bureaucratic class, people who have experience of governing. On the other hand, you do have to have change, and you can't have people who were part of the former regime leading a new Libya. I think we're going to have to see some kind of process of truth and reconciliation, and of moving forward. We are also going to have to see some convictions.
And how long will this process take? I mean, the French Foreign Minister, Alain Juppé, was in, as you know, in Libya just a few days ago, and he was reminding a youth audience that the time between the French Revolution to when France actually became a democracy was nothing short of 80 years. He hopes it will not take as long in Libya. How long might it take?
Well, I hope it's not going to take 80 years, but I can see it taking, as long as a decade to even begin to build institutions, to begin to build the experience among the people who run them, and to even have people, understand, what it means to have a democratic government. Because there are things that are often taken for granted, but when you've been living for decades under a dictator, are going to feel very, very alien to you.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Portia. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
We're at the end of part one. We'll be back with part two. I'll be discussing London's Olympic Games with the man in charge, the man responsible, Seb Coe. Of course, two great Olympic victories. This will be a different sort of Olympic victory if it happens. That's after this short break.